This is chapter 18, An Era of Reform, and basically what this chapter is talking about is how people in the United States gained basic rights. So remember, up until this point, it was mainly white male adults who were able to vote or have good jobs or hold public office or anything like that. And this is starting to talk about how that changed in the United States. The first vocabulary word in this chapter is actually an event, and that's the Second Great Awakening. And that's a revival of religious feeling and belief in the 1820s and 1830s. There's a First Great Awakening, which started in the colonial times, so in the 1700s. And during the First Great Awakening, people were really into their faith, but at the same time they started becoming more pessimistic about their faith, because that was when there were teachings such as predestination. And now the Second Great Awakening completely reverses that and tells people that they can be saved and go to heaven if they do good works while they're on earth. Transcendentalism is also another movement. There's a lot of literary works that came out during this time, so a lot of great authors and great books that were coming out, and also poetry. And that's a philosophy which taught that people should go beyond logical thinking to reach their true understanding. So people would go out into nature a lot and basically try to think about life while out in nature, and not necessarily using logic and reasoning like math and science. Instead, they were just kind of thinking to themselves and using nature to think about life. Public schools are schools that are paid for by taxes and managed by the local government. So, for example, Dayton Early College is a charter school, but it's also a public school because taxes help pay for it. And so most of the schools around that you know of are public schools. That's opposed to private schools where you have to pay tuition to go to the school. Abolitionists are people who favored ending slavery, and the Declaration of Sentiments is a formal statement of injustices suffered by women written by the organizers at the Seneca Falls Convention. So this is basically where a group of women got together and wrote down all the injustices that women face, and they called it the Declaration of Sentiments. One of the earliest social reformers that we have is Sojourner Truth, and she was a former slave who spoke out for equal rights and for ending slavery. And she's really important because she was a very powerful speaker. A lot of times she was able to recruit a lot more abolitionists, which again are people who want to end slavery. And she told stories about her life as a slave and about the slave children and how they were abused. And she was just a really motivational speaker. And because she was so tall and she was such a strong speaker, she really gained a lot of support for the abolitionists and people who wanted to end slavery. The Second Great Awakening also, like Sojourner Truth, helped kick off this whole era of reform, because it was where really charismatic preachers would go out and make these big gatherings and get tons and tons of people, and they were all really good preachers and really great speakers who could really capture the attention of the people who would come to these meetings. And they encouraged people to try and improve society so that they could reach salvation, so that they could go to heaven. And the goal that they wanted people to strive for is to create a heaven on earth by doing good works. Transcendentalism we talked about a little bit in the last slide, but just to go into a little bit more detail, two of the major starters and authors that you'll probably learn about later on, but also a little bit in this chapter, is Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And they really urge people to question society's rules and institutions. So again, they're kind of challenging how the United States is set up at this point, challenging the notion that only white males are in power and only white males really have the utmost freedom. They wrote a lot about nature and nonconformity, and another thing they did is they started model communities, which is where people would kind of help each other out and basically live together, work together, share everything they had, and just try and create a little utopia or a perfect society. Another major change that happened during the era of reform is reform treatment for prisoners and the mentally ill. Up until this point, prisoners were treated absolutely horribly in jails. Prisoners, including children, would be literally chained up and locked in cages. And there was another thing called debtors' prisons, which is where people who owed money, even just amounts of less than $20 were put in jail. And obviously that was kind of a problem, because how are you supposed to be able to pay off those debts if you're stuck in jail and you can't work and you can't earn any money? So people would literally take out a loan, maybe they can't pay it back right away, and then all of a sudden they're in jail and they can't work and they're basically stuck in jail because they have no way of paying off those debts. So it was almost like an endless cycle. There was really nothing you could do unless a family member or a friend paid off that debt for you. Another thing that was really shocking was that the mentally ill were put in jail and whipped, and they really had no idea how to handle people who had mental disabilities such as severe autism or maybe Down syndrome, and diseases that we see as kind of common today. You wouldn't see as much back in this time, because those people would all be in prison, and they were really mistreated and sometimes violently whipped if they misbehaved. So Dorothy Dix is one person who really helped reform this. She helped improve conditions for prisoners and treatment by reporting on these horrendous things that were going on in the jails, and she was a very outspoken woman who really helped kick things off in the era of reform. And eventually she did convince legislators to create asylums for the mentally ill, where they would be cared for instead of violently beaten and whipped. And so the mentally ill were taken to these asylums where they were kind of secluded away from society, but at least they weren't being mistreated, they were being cared for, and research was being done on them to figure out how to cope with these diseases and how to try and incorporate them into society. And obviously that's been successful, because today people who have these mental disabilities are incorporated into public schools. They can get educations, they can get jobs, they can participate in things like Special Olympics and become productive members of society. Dorothy Dix's work also helped abolish debtors' prisons, and so that was really important, because again, that was basically a really unfair way of punishing people who owed debts. So today you can't go to jail just because you owe some money. She also helped create a separate justice system for children, so you wouldn't have children being locked up next to, these adult murderers, and they wouldn't be whipped in jail or locked in cages either. They would be completely separate from all these adults. So you can imagine if you've been in trouble with the law before you're 18, maybe you're as young as like 13, you could have been locked up before with, a 40-year-old murderer, and Dorothy Dix helped change that. So there is a completely different justice system for juveniles now. And then another thing that Dorothy Dix helped change was violent punishments. So we talked about whipping a little bit before, but another thing that they would do in prisons was brand prisoners. And remember, we talked about branding in the last chapter. They did it to cattle, but they also did it to people in prison, where they would take a hot iron and press it to somebody's skin so it would make a burn mark on their skin to show that they were a criminal. But that was abolished after Dorothy Dix's work. Education was another thing that was really improved during the era of reform. Remember, in the early 1800s, most children didn't go to school. It was mostly wealthy parents who paid for private schools or home tutors to come and educate their children. So it was really a very small group of people who were receiving educations. And that was a real problem, because children wouldn't really have anything to do with their everyday lives. And so they would start creating a bunch of mischief, especially in the cities, to entertain themselves. And so sometimes they would do violent things like start fires, or they might steal, basically do anything they could, one, to try and maybe provide for their families, but also just to entertain themselves. And so New York created a public elementary school in the early 1820s, and that's when the whole notion of public schools, or schools paid for with taxpayer money, was started. And Horace Mann was a really big proponent of these public schools, and he helped convince people in Massachusetts to pay taxes so that all these children who were causing problems in the cities could go to school and become productive members of society, rather than just be making trouble in the streets. And he was largely successful. By the 1850s, most white boys in the North and West attended school. In the South, they didn't really grasp onto the whole concept of public schools as much, but there were a few public schools even down south for white children. Girls and African Americans, however, were still not allowed. Higher education was available for some women, though. In 1837, Ohio's Oberlin College was the first college to allow women, and by the 1860s, most colleges accepted women. So Ohio's Oberlin College was the first one that really set the precedent for the rest of the country to allow women in education. And African American schools were started, but they were violently harassed and forced to close down. And sometimes whites would get really upset by the whole notion of African Americans receiving education, and they would attack the schools and basically force them to close down. And especially in the South, whites didn't like the idea of African Americans getting education because they thought it would be a danger to slavery. They thought if African Americans were learning and basically learning how to read and write and how to articulate arguments, that they would eventually be able to convince people to turn against slavery and see how horrible it was. And it turns out that they were right, because the next thing we're going to talk about this chapter is the abolitionist movement, which is where African Americans and whites alike banded together, especially in the North, to speak out against slavery. So fighting against slavery is the next major change that was happening during this time, and there were small groups of people that existed ever since the American Revolution in 1776. The Quakers were a religious group. Maybe some of you have heard of them before. That they had always been against slavery ever since the American Revolution. So basically the entire year we've been talking about how African Americans were mistreated and enslaved, but that wasn't the case for everybody. Some people did believe that slavery was wrong. By 1808, slave importation ends, but slavery was still going strong. So even though Americans couldn't import slaves from Africa and other countries anymore, slaves who had children, those children would be born into slavery. So just by being born African American, you were automatically considered a slave in most parts of the country. And so abolitionists get together and try and think of how to end this cycle of slavery, which seems like it's never going to end, because as long as African American children are being born, there's always going to be slavery unless something changes. So some people want to be extreme and have a violent revolt and pretty much just attack slave owners until they're forced to give up their slaves. Other abolitionists want to just have a peaceful negotiation and just talk things out and hope that southern slave owners will see the problems. And other people wanted to just completely find different new methods of farming, so that way slave labor wasn't necessarily required anymore. They'd be able to make money by farming with other means besides slavery. And so the abolitionist movement at first was kind of discombobulated because no one was really sure how to handle the issue. There wasn't a clear objective because everybody wanted to handle the movement in different ways. William Lloyd Garrison was a white man who started the Liberator newspaper, and that was an abolitionist newspaper that really attacked slavery and its supporters. He wrote persuasive arguments and persuasive articles all the time in the Liberator. He did a whole bunch of other things. And even though he really focused on slavery, he also supported equal rights for women. Frederick Douglass was also a former slave who escaped slavery, and he wrote an autobiography because while he was in slavery, he actually was taught how to read and how to write by his slave master's wife. So his master's wife taught him how to read and write, and eventually that allowed him to escape slavery. And again, he was kind of like William Lloyd Garrison in that he started his own newspaper, which published really persuasive arguments against slavery, and his autobiography really detailed the horrendous things that were going on the slave plantations, and he really helped convince people to turn against slavery. Also, we talked about at the beginning of this PowerPoint Sojourner Truth, and she also really contributed to the abolitionist cause with her persuasive speeches. So during the fight against slavery, women got really heavily involved, and women themselves felt oppressed in society, and they were. And so they were able to sympathize with African Americans who were also oppressed, and they really spoke out against slavery. And once they had their voices heard and people were listening to them and taking their ideas into consideration, they realized that they were earning more power and more respect in society. And so they began to take that and try and gain even more equal rights for women. And so that kind of became its own separate movement. So in addition to fighting for freedom for African Americans, there was an additional fight for equal rights for women. So one of the major conventions was the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, and that's where they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. And it really mimics the Declaration of Independence, pointing out how the Declaration talks about how all men are created equal, and yet that's not really true because women and African Americans are mistreated, and really when they say all men are created equal, they just mean white males. And so they're kind of pointing out how inconsistent they were, and they were really highlighting the fact that men were oppressing women, not allowing them to vote, not allowing them to own property, not allowing them to own their own money. And so the Declaration of Sentiments argued that women should have the right to vote, and that was really shocking even to women at this time because they thought that was way too extreme. They thought they would have to take baby steps and eventually earn the right to vote. But people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued that no, we're people too, we should have the right to vote, just as African Americans should have the right to vote, just as every adult in the United States should have the right to vote. And so Frederick Douglass was really inspired by these women, and even though he was one of the major supporters for ending slavery, he also joined in the fight in fighting for equal rights for women, and so he supported the women's suffrage movement. The women's rights movement was somewhat successful. There was some progress made. For example, in New York, women had some control over their property and wages, so they could earn their own money. They could buy their own property without having to get permission from their husbands or their fathers or whoever the male adult in their life was. In Massachusetts and Indiana, there was more equal divorce laws. So we kind of talked about in the earlier chapters how women didn't really have a lot of rights when they were getting divorced. If they got divorced from an abusive husband, they could lose all of their property, they could become homeless, and they can't earn their own wages. But Massachusetts and Indiana were some of the first states to justify that and give women property during divorce so that they wouldn't be completely homeless after divorcing their husbands. But still, there was no right to vote for women. That wouldn't come until much, much later.